Hello guys. How are you? Today is the best day for spooky stories. Night Town is a scary story about nightmare. Listen this story to the end and find the answer what was really happened. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Sammy was dreaming, he was sure of it. He was walking around the city that he had explored with his parents earlier. In a way the streets were the same, the buildings were the same, painted bright orange and blue and yellow and pink. And there were lots of palm trees to remind him that he was on vacation with his family on a beautiful island in the Caribbean Sea. But everything was all wrong, too. It was night, but the sky had no moon or stars, so he couldn't tell where the light brighter than real moonlight came from. All the street lights were dark. And the streets were empty. Before, they had been crowded with people and funny little cars and donkeys. Now, no matter which way he turned, he saw no one. Doors were closed, windows were dark or had their shutters fastened. It was creepy. But, so far at least, Sammy was happy that it was still only a dream, not a nightmare. He kept walking, since there was no reason to stop. He kept hoping that he would find the main street and see the Beachview Hotel where he was staying with his parents. He had the idea that if he could find his way back to where he was really asleep in his bed, he would wake up and forget this strange dream. Of course, the strangest part was knowing he was in a dream, and thinking he could get out of it, if only he could find his way back. He turned a corner. Halfway down the street he saw a man leaning against a wall. He was dressed in a white suit and white hat and white shoes. Sammy knew he wasn't supposed to talk to strangers. But he was in his own dream now, so he decided everyday rules didn't apply. "Excuse me, sir," the boy said politely. "Could you tell me the way to the Beachview Hotel?" "Sure thing," said the man. Then he grinned and showed his teeth. They were 3 times as long as teeth should be. And they were sharp. Sammy didn't wait. He ran and ran, up one street and down another. He was afraid the fellow with the horrible teeth was chasing him. He kept looking over his shoulder, which was why he ran into the black police officer, dressed in the white coat and shorts and high helmet all police officers wore here. "Stop, boy," the man said, grabbing his arm. "Why are you running?" "Sorry," said Sammy. "I was frightened by a man whose teeth were as long as this." And the boy moved his fingers far enough apart to show the policeman. The policeman nodded. But were they as long as this? He grinned, and Sammy saw the policeman's teeth were twice as long as the first man's and even sharper. With a yell, the boy twisted away from the policeman's grasp and began running again. He heard the policeman laughing behind him. A turn to the right, then a turn to the left, and he was in another strange street. He didn't stop running until he could no longer hear the awful laughter. There was a church in this street. A priest was sweeping the steps. He had on a white robe, but he also had on tennis shoes and a New York Giants baseball cap. He seemed friendly and funny as he waved to Sammy. But Sammy didn't go too close until he saw the priest's teeth. They looked just the right size. "Poor boy," said the man. "You look like you've run a 10-mile race. Is anything wrong?" Still panting, Sammy said, "I met 2 men. One had teeth this long and he showed the priest how long." "Oh, the priest cried. Then, Sammy went on, "I met a policeman who had teeth this long." Again he showed the priest how long. "My, exclaimed the priest with a little grin. "Those are very long. But not as long as these." Suddenly his grin was big as a pumpkin's, and his teeth were growing longer by the minute. Away ran Sammy, promising himself not to stop and talk to anyone. He would just keep running until he woke up. The next street he ran into was the main street. And not far away was the Beachview Hotel. In the middle of the dark buildings, all of the hotel lights were blazing, as if to guide him home. Feeling safer every minute, Sammy ran across the empty hotel lobby, took the elevator to the 7th floor, and saw the door to Suite 710, the room where his family was staying, just down the hall. It was unlocked. He tiptoed inside. The living room looked just as he remembered it. The door to his parents' room was closed, but he could hear his mother's soft breathing and his father's light snoring just inside. He quickly opened the door to his own bedroom. There he saw his real self asleep in the soft light that came through the window where a curtain was only half closed. "Wake up! Wake up!" he shouted to his sleeping self. But the sleeper only turned over and seemed likely to go on sleeping. "Get me out of this dream," Sammy pleaded with the dreamer. When he saw that his words weren't having any effect, Sammy reached over to try and shake himself awake. As soon as his dream hand touched his real shoulder, his whole body jerked as if he had gotten a tremendous electric shock. "Whoa!" he cried, sitting up in bed. He was breathing heavily, and he could feel his heart pounding. He swiped the back of his hand across his sweaty forehead. "I'm back," he assured himself. A minute later, his parents appeared at the door. "What are you shouting about?" asked his father, hurrying to one side of the bed. "Are you all right?" asked his mother, sitting on the other side of his bed. Sammy rubbed his eyes. "I had a weird dream," he said. "I guess it was a nightmare. Anyhow, I was being chased by all these guys with sharp teeth that got longer and longer and longer." "Sounds like a nightmare to me," his father chuckled. "How long were those teeth?" "As long as these?" "Or these?" asked his mother. And just before Sammy pulled the covers over his head and began to scream, he saw through the window that the night sky had light but no moon or stars. The Dark House is a spooky story about a group of friends. The four boys, Eddie, Joe, JB, and Randy, looked at their friend Peter. "Remember," Joe said, "the deal is that you've got to go all the way into the big bedroom upstairs and write the date in chalk beside the closet there. And put your initials," added JB. "That will prove you were there," Joe finished. All five turned to look down the hill toward the old Brewster house. The deserted place, all the kids in town were sure it was haunted, had been empty since long before Peter and the others had been born. Soon it would be torn down to make way for new townhouses. Bulldozers and trucks had already begun clearing and leveling the vacant lots that surrounded the solitary house. Though the moonlit Brewster house stood stubbornly amid the surrounding changes, soon the wreckers would come and tear it down. The neighborhood kids were looking forward to that. But tonight, the boys had come to check out one last time the story that a ghost or something prowled the house at midnight. All the boys had been brave enough to explore the house during the day, even though signs warned trespassers away. But they had gone as a group. None of them wanted to be alone inside, even when the sun was shining. Only a lot of double daring, and the promise of collecting the allowances of the other four boys, had made Peter agree to make this midnight visit alone. The boys had been planning the adventure for days, deciding how they could sneak out and meet without any parents finding out. So far, everything had worked just fine. Yet, though he didn't tell his friends, Peter was beginning to wish that something had gone wrong and that he had been grounded for the night. But here they all were, there was the house, and Joe was saying, "It's almost time. Unless you're going to chicken out on us." "No way," said Peter. He was annoyed that his dry as a bone throat made his voice sound like a frog's croak. Joe smirked. Peter ignored him and made a show of patting his jeans pockets to be sure he had his flashlight and the chalk, so he could write the date and his initials in the big upstairs bedroom. That was where, supposedly, someone had been killed by a monster or scared to death by a ghost or simply vanished. There were as many different stories about the room as there were kids to share them. Even as he made a show of being brave, Peter remembered the worst stories he had heard. But there was no getting out of the challenge now. No midnight monster could be as bad as having his friends call him chicken. So he started walking down the hillside toward the old road and the crumbling house on the other side. He looked back only once, and saw his friends sitting side by side, sharing the candy bars Eddie had brought and watching him to see when his courage would give out. They were all sure he'd never make it through the loose board on the window that kids used to sneak in and out during the day. "I'll show you all," Peter whispered. Though he walked as slowly as he could and still not look like he was scared, he reached the road, and then the rusted iron gate, and finally the front porch far too soon. He had been in the house with the others during the day. Now he tried to tell himself that it really wouldn't be that different by night. And the stories about monsters and ghosts and junk were only stories. Just before he lifted the board that would let him slip inside, he turned and gave a big, defiant wave to his friends on the hill. He saw them wave back. They seemed so tiny in the moonlight. The dark house seemed higher and wider than it ever looked in the sunshine. He climbed through the window. Behind him, the board dropped back into place with a soft chunk that made him jump. The room inside was dark. He snapped on his flashlight, but the beam was weak. Now he remembered that he had meant to get new batteries before he came here. The light was only a thin spear of brightness stabbing into the black. It picked out the side of a wooden box, some fallen plaster, and the corner of a rug so old and mildewed that it looked like it was growing on the floor. Something in the hall beyond the room went chink. Peter froze. "Hello," he said, his voice little more than a whisper. "Is anybody there?" His words seemed to stick in his throat, which had gone too tight to let out much of the sound. Nobody answered. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the dark room and entered the even darker hall. "Hello," he said, louder this time. Nobody answered. Down the gloomy hall he went. Up the dark stairs, jumping with every step that creaked, and most of them did. At the top he paused to listen. Silence, except for the faint chink sound. He angled the flashlight beam up and saw an old light fixture in the stairwell ceiling. Its hanging glass beads, wrapped in spider webs, made the chinking sound as they jostled together in a stray draft. He could feel the same cold air on the back of his neck, and he shivered as if a ghost had puffed its icy breath on him. He fought the urge to run away. He was too close to his goal to back out now. The door to the bedroom he had to enter was closed. He reached for the knob, half afraid that he would see it begin to turn by itself, as something inside got ready to pop out. That's the sort of thing that happened in the scary DVDs he loved to watch with Randy and Randy's older brothers. "Don't stop now," he urged himself. He pushed the door wide on the darkest space yet. Across the room, the door to a dark closet was wide open. A little moonlight came through windows caked with dust. That was good, because the batteries in his flashlight gave out at that moment. But the wall between the shadowy closet and the dark corner caught just enough light so he could see to write. Quickly he got out his chalk and scribbled the date and his initials. Something sighed in the dark closet. Peter turned. He couldn't get his feet moving. There. He was sure he had again heard something, breathing or whispering in the inky interior. Something soft fell in the closet. Peter yelled. Out jumped a dark. Nothing. Smooth move, chicken, he mocked himself. He tried to shake the flashlight back into life. No luck. He turned to go. Something soft tunked in the closet. Fool me once, shame on you, he said, repeating one of his mother's favorite sayings. Fool me twice, shame on me. He turned to go. Something dark and big put a cold, hairy hand on his shoulder. Nobody's fooling anyone, said a voice as cold as the hand. Peter yelled, twisted free of the hand, and ran out of the bedroom. He paused just long enough to slam the door shut. It stuck for a moment. He heard the something rattling the knob. He half stumbled, half fell down the stairs. He was raising the window board when he heard something come bumping, thumping, galumphing down the steps behind him. He threw himself out through the opening, bruising his shoulder. For a minute his jeans cuff caught on a nail, but he ripped it free. Now he was running down the path, past the rusty iron gate, across the road. Without stopping, he looked back. Two hairy arms slammed the board off the window, sending it flying into a bush. A huge form squeezed through a moment later. The giant, shadowy shape chased him. Peter ran faster, struggling up the hill toward his friends. But if he thought they were going to help him, he was wrong. The minute they saw that something was following him, Eddie, Joe, JB, and Randy scattered in 4 different directions, each of them yelling his lungs out. The shadowy thing was catching up. Fear gave Peter an extra burst of speed. He crossed the top of the hill and charged down the brush-covered slope on the far side. He took the paths between the bushes and briars that were boy-sized, but not wide enough for the big shadowy something that was chasing him. He heard brambles and branches snap and crackle as they snagged and caught at the monster, slowing it down. Across the edge of the cemetery, through the park, and onto the sidewalks of town Peter ran, thinking only of getting home. When he was just a few doors from his house, and his legs were so tired he could hardly move them, he dared to turn and look back down Maple Street. The sidewalks and road were empty. Under the full moon, nothing moved except a cat darting from one side of the street to the other. He had lost the thing. He was safe. Just a few more steps to home. Peter turned into his own yard. He had just put his foot on the front step when the big, dark something grabbed him with 2 big, hairy hands. "What's the matter?" it rasped. "Don't you like me?" Gray was the scariest movie monster of all time, said Alec Pardo, slowing the car as traffic began to back up near the end of the San Mateo Bridge, connecting the peninsula below San Francisco with the East Bay area. Nancy Kim, sitting beside him in the front seat, said, "That was his name? Just Gray?" "Well, sometimes he was called Mr. Gray or Graymaster or something like that. Of course, we're talking about silent movies, so you'd just see it printed on a card in between shots." In the back seat of the car, Alec's 12-year-old sister, Alana, adjusted her headphones and pumped up the music on her CD player. Talk about old movies bored her as much as it turned her older brother on. She was annoyed to find that her best friend, Nancy, was genuinely interested. She had invited Nancy along to keep her company, but her friend was caught up in Alec's tiresome talk about silent movies and old film stars and movie studios that had gone out of business countless years ago. Alana had heard it all too many times before. It was the curse of having a brother working on his master's degree at the San Francisco Film Academy and 2 parents involved in the business. Their father was director of photography, their mother was a special effects makeup artist. In fact, Alec was taking care of his younger sister while their folks were working on Alien Abduction, Part 2, on location in New Mexico. Their mom had created the creepy alien greys for the original film and now was making the latex monsters even creepier for the sequel. As part of his study of filmmaking in the San Francisco area, Alec often visited the sites of the old studios, all long gone except for an occasional building or historical marker. But Alec liked to soak up the atmosphere, get a feel for the old places. So today they were taking a long, dull drive to the town of Dunham, where what was left of the old SSGG studios could be found. The letters stood for Silver Screen Golden Gate, Alec had explained to Nancy earlier, while his sister, in the back seat, tried to keep from shouting, "Who cares?" Movies, to her, were something you did for fun or, in their parents' case, to earn a living. They were not something you studied and talked about as if they were religious experiences. "Are we there yet?" Alana asked, deliberately sounding as backseat bratty as she could. "Not much longer," her brother said good-naturedly. "There's the Dunham exit ahead." They made the turn and were soon following the road to the town tucked back in the hills burned brown by the summer heat. "What made this gray guy so scary?" asked Nancy. "That's hard to say, exactly," Alec replied. "None of the movies still exist. All the masters and most copies went up in smoke during the fire that destroyed SSGG Studios in 1928. There were 12 gray movies made, plus one that was never released. Supposedly unlucky number 13 was so scary, the studio felt it might frighten some people to death. According to the old stories, even August McGuire, who founded the studio, he was sometimes called Money-Grubbing McGuire, was willing to keep the film from being shown, because it was too awful. I guess it's sort of like when that studio kept the old movie Freaks from being shown, because people might be so grossed out. Don't movie people always use ads that say how horrible and disgusting scary films are to get people to come? Nancy wondered. That's kind of a modern idea. But even back in the 50s and 60s, they'd sometimes have nurses in the lobby of the theater or make people sign a paper saying they wouldn't sue if they suffered shock, or sometimes they even promised money to the survivors of anyone who died of fright. Those were all gimmicks. They were passing through the sleepy little town of Dunham, rolling along tree-shaded streets, heading into the canyon beyond that housed the old studio. But Gray seems to have been something different, Alec continued. For one thing, he seemed to be able to scare everyone. But people could never say exactly what had frightened them so much. In fact, Gray seemed to take different shapes in different films, or even in the same film. They were all black and white back then, but people would talk about gray mist or a gray man or a gray vampire. No two could agree on exactly what they thought they'd seen. Weird, said Nancy. There was even a theory that the movies used some form of subliminal perception, huh? Secret messages hidden in the film that flashed by too fast for people to realize, even though they got the meaning at some unconscious level. It supposedly worked like hypnosis. They tried it once, hiding messages like buy popcorn in movies to get people to buy more at the snack bar. It didn't work, and advertisers got in trouble for trying it. If any of the Gray films survived, you could study them by freezing the video or DVD frames to see if there was some message hidden in the film. But there's no copy anywhere. So they might have put a message like "This is really scary" to make people think they were seeing something horrible, said Nancy. But I doubt that happened way back then. More likely it's a case of old stories growing more fantastic the more people tell them. What would be really scary to you? Asked Nancy. I don't know. Night of the Living Dead zombies, I guess. Snakes would do it for me, said Nancy, with a shudder. Alana, she called, loud enough to force her friend to remove her earphones. What scares you the most? Getting stuck on a perfectly good Saturday driving to a totally boring place with the two of you talking about totally boring old movies and junk. Spiders, said Alec. Sis has arachnophobia. Wasn't that a movie? Yeah, but it means fear of spiders. Spiders drive her crazy. Shut up, said Alana. But he went on. She even believes all those old stories about the girl who ratted her hair and never washed it and brushed against a tree so spiders got into her hairdo and ate into her brain. You, cried Nancy. Shut up, Alana repeated. I hate your talking about that stuff. There's another one about a woman who got bitten on the cheek by a spider, and the side of her face began to swell, and millions of baby spiders burst out when she went to the doctor. Alana clamped her headphones back on and turned the volume up to the last notch. A few moments later, they rounded a turn in the road. Alec pulled over and parked the car. The old SSGG studios, he announced. Where? Asked Nancy. Curious, Alana leaned between the other two to look out the front window. Oh, I see like part of a wooden wall over there, and there seems to be something behind that clump of trees. I guess that fire pretty well wiped everything out. Alec got out a copy of an old photograph from the San Francisco Public Library. He stood beside the car, looking down at the photograph, then pointed out various things to Nancy. Alana remained sitting in the car, flipping through her CD folder. Those were the dressing rooms over there, and the editing rooms. There, where that bit of steel frame is still standing, was the main stage. The old carpentry and paint workshop would have been there, and the costumes there. The vaults where the film was stored would be right behind. That's where the fire began. I want to walk around, soak up the atmosphere. Are you coming? Sure, Nancy responded. Alana? I'm going to listen to music and soak up the sun. Enjoy yourself, said Alec. Don't let the spiders bite. He and Nancy set off exploring. Alana unrolled her bamboo beach mat, and peeled off her blouse and jeans to reveal the bathing suit underneath. Then she positioned the mat on dry grass, careful to avoid any logs or bushes or tumbled stones that might hide a dreaded spider. When she'd slathered on enough sunblock lotion and put on her Ray-Bans, she replaced her headphones and settled back to enjoy the day her way. Something tickled her cheek. With a yelp, she brushed frantically, remembering Alec's spiders in the face story. To her relief, it turned out to be only a leaf. She lay back down in the warmth, but now her mind was suddenly filled with spidery gray images. She thought of a hairdo, veiled in gray cobwebs, alive with pale gray spiders. She imagined a swollen cheek, the gray of dead skin swarming with unseen baby spiders. She also remembered the long, spidery fingers of the tall, willowy, ghost-like alien creature, called a gray, that her mother had designed for the science fiction film Alana's parents were working on. Eventually, she fell asleep, but she had nightmares of cobwebs and mist and tall beings whose skin rippled from swarms of tiny, living creatures teeming just below their dead, gray skin. She awoke with a shudder, happy that the dream images were already fading from memory. But something was wrong. The sun had dropped to a late afternoon position just above the horizon. She pulled up her dark glasses to look at her watch. It was almost 4 p.m. Where were Alec and Nancy? She wondered. What could they have found that would hold their interest for nearly 4 hours? She pulled her jeans back on and buttoned her blouse. She started down the path through the brush and dry grass toward the spot where still-standing metal ribs marked the old main stage. It seemed as good a spot as any to begin her search. She called her brother's name, then her friend's, several times, but there was no answer. Maybe they went on a hike farther up the canyon and lost track of time, she thought. In the lengthening shadows, the curved metal beams overhead, the glass panels they'd once supported having long since vanished, reminded Alana of a skeleton's rib cage. To her disgust, the remains of the old building were thick with spider webs. In every corner and crevice, she could see the cottony gray shapes of egg sacs. She retreated quickly. More calls got no response. She followed the crumbling remains of a concrete path and suddenly found herself at the edge of what looked at first like an empty swimming pool, but which she quickly recognized as the foundation of a collapsed building. The bottom was littered with tumbled stone and twisted metal and fragments of wood, all showing traces of a fire. She remembered her brother talking about the vault where all the old movies had been stored, and where the fire that destroyed the studio had begun. On the far side of the immense, blackened, sunken area, she found a path that led back into the thicker growth. Careful not to brush against any bushes that might hold spiders in ambush, she decided to follow the path a short way. She might meet Alec and Nancy coming back from the hike that seemed the only explanation for their long absence. She had been following the zigzagging path for about 20 minutes when it suddenly ended in a sinkhole where the earth had fallen in to form a crater. To Alana, it looked as though the roof of a vast cave had suddenly dropped away. The edge of the crater was crumbly underfoot. If she wasn't careful, she realized, it could suddenly give way and she'd slide to the bottom, now heavily shadowed in the evening. Could Alec and Nancy have fallen in? She wondered anxiously. She leaned over and called down, but there was no answer. Suddenly the seemingly solid ground she was leaning on gave way, and she started to slip down the wall. Frantically, she scrambled back. She remembered sickening images from one natural history TV show of a bug called an antlion that buried itself at the bottom of a funnel-shaped crater, a miniature version of the one she was struggling against. The insect hunter lurked, waiting for an unfortunate ant to tumble down the crumbling earth to become its dinner. Sudden fear gave her strength. She scraped her palms but managed to shove herself back to safety. There she sat, breathing heavily. She shivered at the thought that her brother and her friend might have fallen in. She called again and again, but there was only silence. Telling herself that they might have gone in 1,000 different directions, promising herself they were already back at the car waiting for her, she started to turn away from the pit. There was movement at the bottom. Something rippled like gray cloth. She thought of spiders and their egg sacs, teeming with baby spiders about to be spewed into the world. Careless now of the bushes and weeds that jabbed her hands and brushed her legs, she ran back down the hillside. At last, she broke free of them and reached the edge of the burned vault. Alec and Nancy were sitting side by side on the edge of the sunken area, their legs dangling into the fire-charred opening. "Hey, sis, what's your hurry?" called Alec. "You look like you've seen a ghost," added Nancy. Seeing them, Alana suddenly felt like a fool for scaring herself. "I was worried about you," she said to hide her lingering fear. "Here," Nancy invited, patting the edge of the foundation, "sit beside me. We've got a story to tell you." "Shouldn't we get going?" said Alana. It was so late that the vault was filling with shadow, like ink in a swimming pool. "Sit," Alec ordered. When she sat, he continued, "We learned a lot about this place, and a lot about Gray. It would make a great science fiction story, only it's true. The fire here," he waved his hand over the deepening shadows below, "wasn't an accident. It was set by August McGuire, the man himself. He was trying to get rid of Gray. Oh, yes, Gray is quite real, as well as the movies that he had made about the mysterious Gray. Seems McGuire learned that Gray was using the films to change audiences, mess with their minds. A little like that subliminal business we talked about earlier, but far more advanced." "You're making this up," said Alana. "There's no way you could know any of this. And if you're trying to scare me, it isn't working." She started to get up, but Nancy grabbed her wrist and held on with surprising strength. "Don't go yet," Nancy said. "Gray comes from another place," Alec went on. "He came as planned, but something happened to the equipment that brought him here and was supposed to help him with his work." "This is so boring," Alana said petulantly. "Space aliens conquer the world. Get real. Mom and Dad are working on this movie. Can't you come up with a better story than that?" Alec ignored her. "Gray and what survived of the machinery wound up buried in these hills for years, until McGuire discovered them while building SSGG Studios. They formed quite a team for years, until McGuire decided to save the world." Alec gave a harsh laugh that made Alana's skin crawl. He almost succeeded, but a part of Gray escaped the fire, got to the still-buried machinery, and began healing. Gray has gotten stronger and has learned a few new tricks. He's discovered that the world has changed in ways that will help what Gray needs to do. "Boo." Alana sneered. "I'll catch the reruns on Creature Features." She jerked her arm free of Nancy's grasp. "One last thing," said Alec. "Gray likes to play mind games. Gray enjoys scaring people." But Alana, angry at the others for their stupid attempt to frighten her, was already storming up the path. She turned around. In the twilight, the two seated figures, with their backs to her now, suddenly looked pale as ghosts or mummies shrouded in pale rags and cobwebs. Even as she watched, they seemed to deflate, like balloons with slow leaks. Alana had the impression of grayness leaking out of them, puddling around the shrinking shapes. "Lights," called Alec, from somewhere behind her. "Cameras," called Nancy. "Action," called a strange voice that sounded like dozens of voices blended together. Alana was running now, through the dusky ruins of the old studio. But the skeleton of what had been was changing all around her into the studio of old. Walls sprang from foundations, the steel beams over the main stage healed themselves into perfect arches, glass panels grew to fill in the spaces. Alana spun frantically to avoid walls and doors and railings that hadn't been there a moment before. But everything was as colorless as the black and white photograph of the old studio that Alec had been looking at earlier. "Alana," called the strange many voices in one. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw a misty gray form gliding down the restored path that led between two workshops, their windows glowing with eerie gray light. Terrified beyond reason, she wrenched open the door before her, slammed it, and turned the lock, which gave a satisfyingly loud click. Only then did she look around her. She was on the set of an old castle, as corny as the ones in the original Dracula movie her brother watched over and over. Above the black and white painted stone walls, the first stars of evening glittered through the new glass panels. Lights flared soundlessly around her. Silence lay thick over everything. She opened her mouth to cry, "Help me, please, someone," but no sound came out. It was as if her ears were plugged. No, she realized suddenly, it's like I'm stuck in an old silent movie. Gray, whatever he is playing with my mind. She looked down and discovered that her blouse and jeans had changed into a gown like the women wore in Dracula. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught the movement of French doors blowing open, from a gust of wind generated by an unseen fan. Beyond the doors was the painted backdrop of English moors, with painted gray fog drifting over distant hills, while a painted gray-white moon was frozen in the night sky. A shape appeared suddenly between the painted countryside and the balsa wood French doors. The form was vague. The only thing Alana was certain of was its grayness, the gray of masked spiders' webs, of unhealthy flesh, of the painted mist cloaking the painted hills. It moved closer. Now it looked more like a tall human figure draped in veils. Something like an arm drifted up, something like a finger beckoned her closer. Against every instinct, she stepped nearer. The veils billowed and churned. She knew what was going to happen. She had seen something like this in the old silent movie, The Phantom of the Opera, another favorite of her brother and parents, when the heroine discovers the phantom and pulls his mask away to reveal the skull-like face underneath. This was the famous scene that had audiences fainting or turning away in horror. The veils fluttered and seethed. No more able to resist than the phantom's heroine, Alana raised her hand to the restless gray gauze. For a moment, the rubbery gray face, exactly like one of her mother's latex sculptures of an alien gray, was both a shock and a relief. Then the face melted. The hundreds of multi-legged, multi-jointed creatures that were gray dissolved in front of her, pooling around her feet. Alana felt her mind, then all the rest of her, dissolving into the squirming, hungry, hypnotic grayness. Which was just a preview of what happened to people everywhere when Gray accessed the internet.